Hello and welcome to today's lesson, which is on The Man He Killed by Thomas Hardy. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some context behind the poet himself, Thomas Hardy, and then we're going to look at the historical event and war that inspired Thomas Hardy to write this poem, The Man He Killed. Okay, so a bit of information about Hardy. So he was born in the 1840s. He is a famous poet and author whose work often focused on serious subjects. His novels, particularly, were known to strike quite a melancholy tone. His famous novels include Jude the Obscure and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. He started writing poetry in the 1890s when he was already in his 50s, and this is significant because at this point he'd already seen a lot of the world, and this really is reflected in the sombre nature of some of his poems. To set this up then, in 1898 South Africa was all part of the British Empire, and it was actually said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Canada, Australia, India, various African countries, such as Nigeria and South Africa, were all part of the British Empire. It really was a vast empire and the biggest empire in history, it should be remembered. So the South Africans who were there, who were known as the Boers, didn't like being ruled by the British, as many countries didn't like being ruled by the British. Obviously, it was quite an imperial system where the British Crown would make rules that would be implemented in countries overseas, and obviously the native people in those countries were not a fan of this. So the Boers who were already there protested and started fighting the British. In response, the British sent in the army and brutally took control against Boers. So Thomas Hardy wrote the poem about how pointless war was to him. He heard reports of the brutality of the Boer War and really wrote this poem to reflect the absurdity of war. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to read through the poem before analysing it in line by line detail. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to whet right many a nipper kin. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead, because he was my foe. Just so, my foe of course he was, that's clear enough, although he thought he'd list perhaps, off-hand like, just as I was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is, you shoot a fellow down, you treat if met, where any bar or help to half a crown. Okay, so let's start off with the first stanza then. So it says, had he and I but met by some old ancient inn. Okay, so at this point, the he is unclear, although we later find out that the he is a man that the speaker killed in war. So it goes, had he and I but met by some old ancient inn. So it's saying, had myself and this man who I killed in a war context met at a pub. That's how Hardy sets up this poem. So had he and this man that he killed met in a pub, what would have happened? Well, he goes on to say, we should have sat us down to whet right many a nipperkin. So had this man, had the speaker met this man who he killed in a pub context, then I'm sure they'd have sat down and had many a beer and drink together. So this word nipperkin generally refers to a sort of half pint, and obviously wet meaning drinking. So they'd have enjoyed, had a good time, enjoyed each other's company, and had many a beer. Had they met in a pub context and they'd have engaged as fellow human beings. However, they don't meet in a pub context, and that's crucial, and this is what the next stanza is about. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face. So they didn't meet in a pub, they were ranged as infantry, so they were on other sides of a conflict in war. And this was their designated place. They were told, you're on this side, you're on that side, and that's how war goes, of course. And staring face to face, so rather than engaging as human beings in a pub, they're face to face, they're seeing each other only as enemies. That's their only label to each other, is as people on other sides of a conflict. Okay. So he says, I shot at him as he at me. So it's unclear who shot at who first, but the point is they're both engaged in this conflict. And the language is deliberately quite basic here. I shot at him as he at me. So there's no specific motivation given other than you're on that side of the war, I'm on this side of the war, so I have to shoot at you and you have to shoot at me. So the simplicity of the language really reflects the absurdity of war, the fact that you are asked to kill people on another side of a conflict just because that's your orders to do so, just because you fight under a different flag, you are asked to take a person's life. And again, there's a real stark simplicity of language used in this next line, and killed him in his place. So it doesn't go into the graphic detail of the death or specify exactly how he died other than being shot, but killed him in his place. So there's a real lacking of emotion in how Hardy describes this death. And this is deliberate, because actually, if you think about it, if you are being asked to kill a soldier on the other side of a conflict, you have to take away your emotions from that. You have to reduce the humanity in the person who's fighting on the other side. You have to see them merely almost as an object belonging to that other flag. And this is why there's no great emotional depth to this line. Killed him in his place. I had to kill him because he fought under that flag, so it was my job. I was tasked with killing him. So we go on to the justification of this killing. So the poem goes, I shot him dead because. So it sounds like here, again, we have the stark simplicity of language. I shot him dead. This is a simple task that this person has been asked to execute, the killing of a man. However, obviously, we know that that can't be a simple task. That is a very serious and grave thing that he's been asked to do. But he words it in that basic, simple language because to him, he has to rationalize it as a simple task because that's what he's been asked to do. He has to do it. I shot him dead because. So it looks here like there's going to be a straightforward justification for it. I shot him dead. Yes, that's serious, but this is why he did it. Now we've got, if we go on to the next line, I shot him dead because he was my foe. So the reason, the only reason why he killed a man is because that person was his enemy. Why was the person his enemy? Well, because he was fighting on the other side. That's the only justification. And again, the simplicity, the stark simplicity of language is used to reflect the absurdity of war. Well, why are you killing that person? Is it just because arbitrarily you've been told he is your foe, shoot at him? It's very significant, the repetition of the word because here, and also the use of the dash here. So it almost suggests that he starts off with the intention of having a straightforward justification of why he killed this man. But then it's almost like language slightly fails him here and he begins to stutter. And this dash here is used as a deliberate pause. He has to pause and really think again his justification. It started off so simple, but he's thinking, because why did I actually kill him? And again, the repetition of because is very significant, as if he's taking a moment to reflect on, really, he knows why he shot the man dead. He's really beginning perhaps to question um, the legitimacy of his orders here. So I shot him dead because he was my foe. He almost stutters as he begins to justify that killing, because ultimately the killing can't be justified. So we go on. Just so, my foe, of course he was. The reason he shot this man dead was because that man was his enemy. Simple justification. Again, there's punctuation used to interrupt the sentence, to suggest that he's pausing, he's unsure of that justification. And we call this a caesura. Okay, and a caesura is punctuation used to interrupt the flow of a sentence. So he seems at the start of this sentence or line, just so. And that really suggests that he's quite confident in that justification. Just so, it's quite right that he killed this man because he was on the other side of the battle. But then again, just like we had before, the punctuation leaves a pause, and that pause is reflection time, both for us and the speaker, to reflect, why did he kill this man? Apart from that he was told, obviously, that this man was his foe, his enemy. My foe, of course he was. So again, it's almost like the speaker is trying to kid himself. Of course, this is fine. Of course he was my foe. He's trying to kid himself, trying to trick himself into believing the justification. And who is making this justification? Of course, really, it's his higher ups. It's the generals and the colonels ordering this action, and he's trying to really believe in it himself by repeating to himself, because he was his foe. And again, this confidence in his justification is in here as well. That's clear enough. So he's again trying to say, it's very clear, I have very clear grounds for taking a life. Again, we see a caesura, pause for reflection, and this word which brings doubt, although. So we start off with very positive, assertive language. That's clear enough. This is why I did it. Then there's a caesura, pause to reflect, although. This is a little niggle of doubt, although. Why has he actually done that? So we go on, the next line. He thought he'd list. So we're talking about the man he killed, the man that the speaker killed in a war context. He thought he'd list perhaps offhand like. So the man, why did he sign up to the army in the first place? And that's what the word list means. So he thought he'd list perhaps offhand like. So offhand suggesting quite a casual reasoning for signing up. Perhaps the man who ended up dead didn't truly think through the implications of what signing up for war actually meant. He did it quite casually, offhand. So offhand, like, just as I was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. So why particularly had this man signed up? Well, perhaps out of economic necessity. He signed up quite casually, but then he says out of work and had sold his traps. So what does traps mean? Well, it means possessions. So this man was quite desperate economically. He had to sell all of his possessions. So that was definitely a key motivation in him signing up for war. Obviously, this is a job, and this is what it should be remembered as well. Becoming a soldier was a job, was a profession that you got paid for. So this was the reason. And this really makes the killing almost even more ridiculous and absurd. Why are you killing people in war? Well, it's your job to do that. It is your profession. It's not your job, unfortunately, if you're in the army, to question the decisions of your higher ups. You are asked to carry out orders, and in this case the orders are to kill. And obviously Thomas Hardy thinks that's rather ridiculous, that people are being killed by other people, and actually these people aren't soldiers who have some desperate, deep-rooted hatred for each other. They're just being asked to kill because it's their job, because they were poor, because they'd sold their possessions and didn't have any choice but to sign up for war. And this is sort of affirmed with the last line of this stanza, no other reason why. So we often think of soldiers defending our country, which is often true, but it sounds as if these soldiers didn't really have a deep-rooted sense of patriotism or some deep-rooted commitment to the cause of the Boer War. The only reason this man, who ended up dead, signed up was because he was poor, he'd sold his possessions, he was out of work, and that's why he signed up. And of course, the tragedy of this is that economic necessity caused him to sign up for war, and then he ends up paying for that decision with his life. So the next line, yes, quaint and curious war is. So this is almost the biggest understatement of the century. And these adjectives here, quaint and curious, are very, very mild words when used in a war context. So quaint means slightly odd, and again, curious, similar meaning, means, prompting curiosity, slightly odd. So quaint and curious war is, but obviously we know that war is bloody, brutal, ends up with millions of deaths being caused. So why does Hardy use such mild language, quaint and curious? It is obviously an understatement, but he's really trying to it's almost that Hardy lacks the language to fully sum up the absurdity of war. So it's almost ironic, and the exclamation mark, which would usually be used often in a light-hearted comedic setting. Yes, quaint and curious war is. It is a light-hearted understatement. Perhaps Hardy again is speaking to the sheer absurdity of war. War is silly. War is curious. War is quaint. It is ridiculous that people are being asked to kill people they don't even know for a conflict and a territory that they don't really have a deep-rooted connection to. So the next line, you shoot a fellow down. Again, fellow, it's quite light-hearted language to use when you're talking about a killing. You shoot a fellow down. You treat, if met, where any bar is, or help to half a crown. So again, this poem is really about how we respond to each other as human beings, and how war really minimizes and reduces our natural human instincts. Obviously, human beings are, by their nature, very social creatures, and our instincts is to help each other. However, in a war, those natural human instincts are suppressed, and that's what the poem is talking about here. So if in a ridiculous war situation you would shoot a person because that is your job to do so, even though you don't know their name, you don't know their backgrounds, you will shoot that person because it is your orders to do so. However, if you meet that person in a bar, you're going to treat that person well, or if they were in need, you might indeed help them with a gift of a small amount of money, because that's natural human nature, is to help each other and obviously to socialize with each other. But again, that key message of the poem, war warps humanity so that we do things that we would not do in any other context. Okay, so the final thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the form and structure of poem. So the poem is written in quatrains, so this is a a form of poetry that we've looked at in other poems in the Edexcel conflict series. So this means 4-line stanzas. It's a very consistent form. So it almost creates quite a simple, almost nursery rhyme style to the poem. And this is again in contrast to the gravity of the subject matter. But if we think about what I've just said when I've been analysing the poem itself, this perfectly marries together, because actually you've got a poem rather that's all about contrast. You've got on one side how you behave in a pub context or a everyday context, and on the other side you've got behaviour in a war context. So it really matches with this, that there is a almost conflict between the form of the poem and the subject matter. Form seems fairly light-hearted, quite neat, but the actual content itself is obviously about killing a man in war. So the form really reflects the absurdity of war. So in terms of the type of poem, because remember, form is all about the shape, size and number of the stanzas, but it's also about the type of poem. So the poem is written as a dramatic monologue. So remember, this is where you have one speaker seemingly speaking to somebody else. So let's conclude by looking at the structure of the poem. And remember, structure refers to the rhyme scheme and the meter of the poem. So the rhyme scheme is very regular. So it's alternate rhyming couplets. And we mark this by talking about A, B, A, B. Okay, and it has this rhyme scheme throughout. So actually, if we can flick back to the last stanza, let's just sort of prove this. So we've got the first and third lines rhyming is, and you've got the second and fourth line rhyming with down and crown. So again, why is the rhyme scheme so regular? What does that mean on a deeper level? Well, very similar to the form, that it's got a regular rhythm. This perhaps represents the strict military nature of a soldier's life, the military regiments and routine. And it also reflects the absurdity of war, how you try and pretend that war is normal, and so you have a normal rhyme scheme, you have a normal form, but actually when you dig beneath the surface, war is actually absurd and ridiculous. That's Thomas Hardy's message. So the meat of the poem, it's comprised rather of iambs. So remember, iambs is where you have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and this looks like da-dum, da-dum. Okay, so it has a da-dum, da-dum, da-dum rhythm. And again, you could definitely make an argument that it's almost a nursery rhyme like rhythm to the poem, and it reflects that absurdity of war, that actually on the surface it seems normal and contained, but as soon as you dig beneath the surface, it is very absurd and immoral. Okay, so I hope you found that helpful. If you have a look at my channel, you can find the other poems in the Edexcel conflict series. Thanks for listening.